This is my Meridian debut and my stage debut, so bear with me, everyone. I am super excited to be here today, and I am really thrilled to announce our guests here today. So we have Joel Khalili, who writes for Wired, and he's actually been on the crypto beat the least of our participants here today. He's been on for just about a year, so he has been following crypto and writing about crypto basically since the FTX, the fall of FTX. So super interesting insights coming from Joel today. I'm excited. We have Lyllah Ledesma, who writes for CoinDesk, and she is our markets reporter. So the highs and the lows and everything in between. So it's going to be awesome to hear from Lyllah. And we have Bjarke Smith-Meyer from POLITICO. He writes in Brussels and is our heartbeat on the regulatory environment in Brussels, as we've seen the EU take such a leadership role in crypto legislation. So I'm so excited. Thank you all for being here with us today. This is a really fun panel because, well, we've got reporters here with us to tell us exactly what it's been like to both cover the industry over the last year, but just generally. And I think it's really important to kind of set the scene for those of you who may work with reporters and may not work with the media on a day-to-day basis, that the crypto beat, and we call it the beat, is a newer one. As crypto has become more mainstream and publications have started to talk more and more about it, they've started to recruit reporters to write specifically on the industry. And I wanted to ask, kind of to break the ice, like, what is, from your all's point of view, been the most exciting part about covering an emerging technology generally, but over the last year? Maybe we can start with Joel, and we'll go through everybody on this one.
Sure, it sounds good. Yeah, I mean, there's really a dull day covering crypto, right? I've only been doing it for a year, but if you think about what's happened in that time, you've had kind of businesses collapsing in on themselves, you've had founders going on the run, you've had legal battles, you've had experimental uses of the technology. So there's never a shortage of things to write about, right? I think a lot of those things are symptoms of the fact that crypto has largely been an unregulated market. So it's possible that the crypto beat becomes a little bit more staid, let's say, over time. But that kind of unpredictable element is something that's certainly exciting. And the other thing is that crypto tends to attract a kind of colorful cast of characters, right? I'm sure there are plenty in this room today, with usually pretty strong convictions in their beliefs, and that's like gold dust for a reporter, right? So that's, yeah.
That certainly makes for a lot of good quotes, I'm sure. Yeah. What about you, Lyllah?
I agree with Joel. I think because it's such a young industry still, it's been so exciting to cover. There's always something new to learn about. I've loved doing the more sort of explainer type stories where you're given a topic and then you kind of have to do a deep dive for a week in it. And it's, like you said, no day is the same. It's always something completely different. And it offers you the ability to learn a lot, which I've loved.
I mean, the unpopular answer would be the most interesting thing is the crash. But from my standpoint in Brussels, I think it's more the political backlash that comes with crypto. Crypto, you can call it a disruptor, you can call it a new technology, but there are things which don't fit which fit awkwardly into the political agenda, whether that's then trying to crack down on certain types of blockchain because of the carbon footprint, or whether it's threatens national currencies. These are the sorts of things that, from a political standpoint, are super interesting to cover.
Yeah, and you all have mentioned, and obviously the topic of this talk is covering through the crypto winter. So, Joel, being the newest one covering the industry, you join, and as you said, things start to happen, and things get, from your all's point of view, I'm sure, very interesting and very exciting, very quick. So when do you think that, when that winter moment happened, what was it, and when did you start to realize it, and where did you go with it?
Right. Yeah. So as you say, I joined Wired back in October. FTX happened within a handful of weeks after me joining, so it's a bit of a baptism of fire. But if we're talking about the very start of the crypto winter, it's probably reach back to before I began covering the sector. You'd probably look at the collapse of the Terra Luna stablecoin, and then the failure thereafter of the businesses that had exposure, whether that's through Ares Capital or Celsius. I think that's a sensible place to start if we're looking for an origin point. I mean, you could make a case that the crypto winter began in earnest slightly later with the fall of FTX, because the implications of that collapse have been so extensive, so diverse. But yes, if we're talking about a starting point, then I think Terra Luna is a good thing to think about.
Yeah, and Lyllah, when you think about Terra Luna and you think about FTX, and specifically your beat being markets, right? What did that mean for your coverage? Like, where, what did you start to? Did it change the way you started to report? Did it change the kind of stories that were coming your way, the kind of pitches you were getting from folks from the industry? What did it mean from you from like a markets perspective and kind of the way you cover the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the turning point was when FTX collapsed. It felt like a lot of crypto coverage became mainstream. So prior to that, it felt like the only people reading my stuff was like super diehard crypto fans, whereas FTX, all of that coverage was in like the likes of New York Times, Bloomberg, like the bigger media outlets were covering it. So I think that it made it more exciting because it was a wider acknowledged topic, and it meant that more people were reading it. It became more exciting to cover, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And Bjarke, I think that's like, that idea of more mainstream. Certainly mainstream attracts eyes of regulators and of policymakers in a way that, they were probably, and they, especially here in the EU, were already very focused. But, how has this, the events changed the conversation in Brussels? And when you're talking, to your sources and to folks in Brussels, what are you hearing back, and kind of how has your coverage from the regulatory perspective changed?
Well, I think it's important to remember that Brussels was way ahead of the pack when you talk about like trade blocks. The fact that they created a rule book for crypto. They started working on this when Facebook tried to launch a stablecoin called Libra back in 2019. So last year they introduced, well, they haven't introduced it yet, but they agreed the final rule book. So over the past year, I guess their response to everything that's happened is kind of like, I told you so. But I mean, currently, we're still seeing that backlash from Libra. I mean, if anything, I always say that Libra is the ghost that haunts this rule book, because you always have these discussions in the background among policymakers of how do we prevent big tech from taking crypto, abusing crypto, whatever, and using it for their own market power gain. And that's where you have topics like central bank digital currencies coming into the fold. So now, I think more than anything, the conversation it was always defensive, and now it's about kind of like battening down the hatches, making sure that, crypto can disrupt, be innovative and everything else, but they're not going to let it completely ruin the game.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think all three of you have talked about that this winter has pushed this industry, into the mainstream. Probably not in the way that, the industry would have liked, right? But here we are, in front of new eyes, certainly a larger population of eyes. And I wonder what that has meant as you've written your stories. How do you think about, okay, I'm maybe not just talking to the industry anymore, right? And, we as an industry talk a lot about talking to each other versus talking to those who may not, be as in touch with, what's happening. So, writing a story and then having to explain maybe more of the high-level concepts. Did you see the need for that as, in the last year as you kind of have expanded your own readership?
Right, yeah. I'm not sure the winter necessarily changed the way that Wired set about covering crypto. I think for a long time, the goal has been to approach the topic with a kind of appropriate level of skepticism, but without spilling into kind of the judgmental or kind of blindly critical. But I do think you're right. I think there is an appetite for content that is able to analyze in a way that non-crypto people can digest, the kinds of challenges and issues the crypto sector faces, because crypto can be a kind of exclusionary space in a lot of ways. It has its own lexicon. It has its own inside jokes and memes, right? Like, it's not for an outsider. It can be it's not particularly approachable. So I do think there is a role for content that kind of acts as or publications that kind of act as an interpreter, right?
Yeah.
And I suppose I see that as part of the role of my coverage.
Yeah, that is such an interesting point. And I wonder, Lyllah, how you can, because I think you were going to say something anyways, but for someone who covers for an industry trade publication where those memes and that lexicon, are very much part of your coverage, I'd be interested in kind of your thoughts on this.
Yeah, sure. I think it's really hard to not get caught up in the industry when you're only, I think it's different for you guys, but when you're only speaking to crypto native people, it's very easy just to write for them. So I think over the last year, I've really tried to, and my editor is always like crashing down on this, like try and write it as if someone on the street could read it. So explain each concept. There's a lot of crypto jargon, which I think can come across as super intimidating, even if you just scroll through Twitter as someone who's not in crypto. Like nearly all of the terminology is like, you can't understand it unless you have some kind of prior knowledge. So I think, yeah, I've really tried to change my coverage in the sense of explaining each and every concept and terminology, just making it more simple, but still making it applicable to those, like, I write a lot for traders who don't want to read all the explanations. They just want to be able to read what's changed, how the price has moved, and so they can quickly skim it. So it's hard bridging those two audiences, but still making it, digestible for both.
Yeah, I am certainly newer to crypto, and the learning curve is steep, just in that way, And so, Bjarke, I would wonder, like, as you're writing for, a very political audience, being from Politico, how do you bridge that between and coming from more macroeconomics, and now you're writing about this very what was niche, but even like the niche language and the very specifics of crypto for that audience, which is very specific as well.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, like Lyllah said, it's a very good training tool to try and write for the layman. You become a better writer for it. Thankfully, I've worked in capital markets as a reporter and banking before, and these guys have created their own language in order to confuse the masses. And so the fact that there is a lot of complicated jargon in crypto wasn't necessarily new. Is a new challenge to me. What's new is trying to explain the difference between proof of work and proof of stake, or
proof of agreement. Go ahead.
Of course, sorry. But also just trying to get people to care at the moment, because I mean, it was easy when you could say, I mean, journalism kind of thrives off of conflict, right? Like that's how you tell a story. You like someone's pushing against something, and then if that's, for instance, whatever, a new disruptor, you kind of really have to try hard to make that case. In a crisis, it's very easy. People are losing money. There are fraudsters here, there are fraudsters there, scammers here. I mean, that's very easy to do. Now, the fact that the crypto market has kind of crashed a little, well, big time, and you have a lot of these bankers and asset managers coming over, and it's kind of like picking up the pieces that they think might be interesting. That's where you have this sort of niche readership within Politico subscribers, where they're quite interested in the technology, and you need to be able to explain that in a more simple way that doesn't necessarily confuse everyone.
Yeah, and that's interesting. Like now that, it's a good point where you're saying like the crash has happened, the tension, it's still there, but we're starting to, maybe navigate a little bit where we're not seeing as much. Now we obviously have the FTX trial ahead of us, and that will certainly create a lot of tension and a lot of news. And I wonder, how has this last year, if at all, kind of changed the way your publication thinks about the industry, and if that has kind of changed the way you approach the stories you might write, or the pitches you might take, or the things that you actually, Bjarke, to you, what you said, might find interesting. Are there new things that you're starting to see kind of come up that you might not have seen before the crash and before this winter that now are piquing your interest about the industry?
Right, I mean, so as I mentioned previously, it probably hasn't changed the way that Wired approaches crypto necessarily, but it certainly kind of dictated the kinds of stories we pursue. So I'm essentially a one-man crypto newsroom at Wired. We do have someone else who covers the kind of intersection of crypto and security, but in terms of pure crypto stories, that's all me. that's meant that you've had to be pretty selective about the stories we go after. And if I look back on my kind of portfolio for the last year or so, and in one way or another, each of the pieces that I've ended up writing has kind of chronicled the implications in their various forms of the FTX collapse. Whether that's on the people that directly lost money, or the businesses that went bankrupt in the aftermath, or the regulatory backlash, the crypto banks that failed. So it perhaps hasn't informed the approach necessarily, but certainly the content. And the other thing I think is worth mentioning is the kind of unique challenges that come with covering the crypto space for Wired as a brand that's considered to be closer to the mainstream. It's perhaps maybe it's not thought of as a kind of mainstream media brand in the same way as the New York Times is, but I think it's certainly seen as maybe among crypto people as kind of an artifact of Web 2, right? And it can mean that sources are sometimes hesitant to speak to you, especially as during the winter, when things aren't going so well, there's an element of suspicion. I think sometimes they assume you're hunting for an angle for a hit piece. Rather than genuinely being on a fact-finding mission. So it's one of the quirks of covering the space, but that's I wasn't necessarily anticipating that before I began covering crypto.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder, Lyllah, you being, again, a trade publication, like when you think about sources, right, and that means you all, people that reporters are looking for to get insight and to get commentary about what's happening. I wonder, has that what has that looked like for you, and has that changed at all?
I think in terms of sources, not so much, but I think what Joel was saying is also similar to us. We saw that there was so many wider, bigger publications covering FTX. I think we saw that as an opportunity for that readership to hopefully come to us for sort of a more detailed explanation, maybe more so on the technical side, or we have a learn page which goes into detail about how everything works. I think we took that as an opportunity of, hey, sort of more regular people are reading about what's going on right now. Hopefully they'll then come to us to get a more in-depth sort of take on what's going on.
I'd be fascinated to see, actually, we don't have the data available probably, but I would be fascinated to see whether there was much overlap, for example, in the kinds of people that come and read my articles versus Lyllah's. Right. That would be quite fascinating to understand, but yeah, who knows.
That is interesting.
I don't know if you noticed, but it even went from my family/friends went from being, I don't really know what you do, I don't really get it, super skeptical, to still being skeptical, and rightly so, but hey, I heard about that big exchange, that's so interesting, what do you know about it? Yeah. Versus I don't know what you do, I don't really want to know either.
I wonder how many people in the audience can relate to that, where all of a sudden, your grandmother or your mother and your father have called and said, I finally maybe have understood. I saw it somewhere in a more mainstream news outlet, and it started to kind of hit differently. Bjarke, I don't know. What do you think from Politico's perspective, and has that impacted?
Well, my grandparents are dead, so I don't have that problem. But no, I mean, in terms of sort of a changing coverage, is that I mean. I'm really interested in seeing, there are certain trends that I kind of see emerging right now. I think the really interesting stories are the human stories. And I don't necessarily mean, I mean, it's not like I want to sit here and, pitch stellar financial inclusion. I'm not doing that. What I mean is how, for instance, in Turkey, where, the purchasing power of the lira is crashing, there, for instance, they're turning to stable coins. Tether in particular, in order to avoid that. I mean, Chain Analysis came out with a report yesterday that looked into this. But that also what's interesting about these stable coins then is that they're kind of deliberately avoiding the regulated jurisdictions, and they're moving into poorer countries, emerging economies, where they can then have a real presence on their own terms and make a lot of money out of it. And so that to me is really interesting to see how that kind of comes up. The other thing is then, to the point of Stellar and everything else, the conversation in Brussels, for so long when it came to crypto, you had the exchanges show up. And in some ways, it was this kind of crypto capitalism on drugs that was arriving and saying we should totally be able to charge insanely high fees for people who want to have financial freedom, they were totally selling this narrative to people and then reaping in the money. Talking about decentralization, but they're as centralized as they get. It was just this old spiel. And now you have these blockchain providers coming in who are kind of I don't want to label anything, but kind of like the crypto communists in the room that are sitting there and talking about like, no, we want to save people, we want to help. And they're kind of coming a little bit late to the party because the crypto capitalists have kind of corrupted the conversation among policymakers. And so the blockchain people are now sort of playing catch up. I think that's an interesting conflict, which is still brewing.
I wonder if you think about that as, you know, even just more generally beyond just regulators, and you think about that from a more general population kind of perspective, as they've maybe been first introduced, you know, as we were just talking about. The way that this has maybe hit the mainstream has certainly been around the winter and the fall of FTX and Terra Luna. You know, and so, you know, where does the industry, where does it go from here, kind of, right? Like, as mainstream has now been introduced, regulators have been introduced first to, you know, one idea or of crypto. Is there a way forward? And how do you guys see that playing out through your journalism and through your reporting and through your talking with folks?
So, sorry, just to clarify, you mean now that mainstream, now that non-crypto people have been exposed to these crypto concepts, where does the conversation go from there? Right. Yeah, tricky one. I suppose a lot is dictated by what happens in the coming 12 months in terms of, you know, let's say another large centralized player collapses, hypothetically. People have that grounding of knowledge. We've been through the FTX collapse now. People understand the kind of degree of the issue. They understand the implications of a collapse of a large crypto business of that kind. So we wouldn't be starting from scratch, for example. I think that's one possible effect, is that there is now a kind of level of understanding that you can assume in a way that perhaps you couldn't previously.
Yeah.
I think it will depend a lot on, I think Joel mentioned this briefly, but it will depend a lot on what the SEC come out with for a Bitcoin spot ETF. I think that if that gets approved, we've already seen the likes of like large asset managers like BlackRock, Fidelity, etc., show an interest, apply. So I think if whichever way that goes, I think that's where the next conversation will be, because we're already talking about that a lot. It's, again, increased exposure for the industry. So I think that will be the next conversation.
Regulation is really slow. And so if anything, policymakers are trying to keep up. So now, for instance, I think even though the rule book in Europe hasn't actually come into force yet, that'll happen next year, they're already talking about, well, what are the extra fixes that we need to sort of get in? And that's where we're talking about DeFi, which also involves tearing down the curtain and revealing that it's not that decentralized a lot of the time. Sorry. But then also, you know, like smart contracts or you know, crypto lending is suddenly coming back into popularity despite Celsius's collapse and the fraud that was exposed behind that. And so there are these other elements that are coming in. What's interesting from my standpoint also is seeing where you have these other elements of fintech kind of creeping in. So, you know, NFTs, for the longest time, for policymakers, that was just about like Bored Apes, you know, or Moonbirds or whatever. Now it's about the Internet of Things, you know, or machine-to-machine communication and processing of payments. So suddenly there are all these other things which are kind of popping up. But I mean, it's not as sexy because it's the mainstream folks and industry coming in and kind of, again, picking up the pieces that's left behind in the rubble.
Yeah. Well, I think I have to wrap up, but I wanted to leave with one question, which is, you all are reporters, so you all consume news constantly. Who is your favorite reporter, or where you get your coverage and where you get your own news?
Okay, so I would say the reports that not specific to crypto necessarily, but the finance reports where I admire most is probably Matt Levine of Bloomberg. It's probably a popular answer if you were to ask the same question to people in the audience here. Often I'm reading his stuff and I think, why did it not occur to me to unpack this complex concept in the way that it's so absolutely crystal clear to the layman? Excuse me. And he does that excellently well. You know, he wrote a piece within the last week that kind of discussed the business model of these stablecoin providers, right? Communicating that to a layman, I think it's no easy feat, but he did it in such an elegant way that, you know, that's something I think to aspire to. I think he's excellent.
Absolutely. His
Yeah.
newsletter is definitely in my inbox. All right, go ahead, Lyllah.
A lot of my crypto news comes from Twitter. It's so quick, and I find it the best way to get like an immediate reaction to news. But other than that, I try and avoid just consuming crypto-related coverage. So I really like Al Jazeera's stuff. There's a really cool Foreign World Roundup newsletter that I love. They don't really report on crypto, but you can kind of bridge the emerging market side of things. They occasionally cover the central bank stuff, which I find really interesting.
That is a great tip.
Well, of course, I read Lyllah and Joel every day. Otherwise, read Politico. Hey. Joking aside, I will first check out what our coverage is doing. I will check out Bloomberg Crypto, also maybe what Fortune has done. But then, like Lyllah was saying, it's not that I want crypto to completely consume my life, so I will read the BBC in the morning and see what's actually happening out in the real world, and listen to the radio and see what's going on in football, soccer, whatever you want to call it. So yeah, I try hard to make sure that it doesn't consume my life.
Wait, you're saying that crypto is not your life? Come on, everybody.
I don't own any, yeah? I'm just saying.
Well, I want to thank you, all three of you, for the conversation and for being here. We have really enjoyed, I really enjoyed this conversation. I knew I would. So I hope you all did, and we will see you later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.